Hi, my name is Danny Siegel, and today I'm going to be doing the topic analysis on the September topic, Resolve, the European Union should join the Belt and Road Initiative. It's a really exciting topic. It's obviously a very important topic considering it's the first topic of the season. Tournaments like UK, Bronx, Yale, and various other tournaments are on this topic. A little bit of advice before I actually go into the topic analysis is I would probably encourage a lot of people on this topic to not rely too much on prep, simply because obviously this topic has been out for a while now and a lot of people have been working on it, but relying too much on prep at this point when you have 3 months of time to actually prep means that you might actually not explain the nuances of your arguments too much, or what you will do is rely too much on evidence and believe that the judge in the back of the room, I think a lot of the time, knows a lot about the topic as much as you and your opponents, and you can end up going down this rabbit hole where you don't explain things very clearly, or you reference certain things related to the topic that most people probably have knowledge of who are competing on the topic, but not necessarily the people in the back of the room. I would say probably even the most technical judges who probably were not working at camps might not necessarily know what you're talking about when you reference acronyms or reference stuff related to the topic that the people maybe talked about at camp, or you found a lot in literature just through your 3 months of prep, even if you didn't go to camp. With that said, let's go ahead and dive into the topic. Before I jump in, let's go over a few different definitions that are obviously important to the topic. Well, first, let's go over the topic. The European Union should join the Belt and Road Initiative. First thing that sticks out to me that you probably need to know about a little bit is the European Union. The European Union is a collection of European countries that are essentially united to promote free trade within them, and also to collaborate with one another on stuff like immigration and on various different things that affect the countries altogether because they're all nearby one another. In recent years, the European countries in the European Union have been under a lot of backlash, and this is largely due to populist movements calling for the European Union to essentially split up. You might be familiar with Brexit. A lot of this populism and backlash comes from the fact that the European Union is still a relatively new concept, and in previous years, in years prior to the 20th century, all of these countries operated as independent of one another. So a lot of the backlash comes from individuals seeing themselves as not Europeans, but instead viewing themselves as French people, English people, German people, and not really feeling the same type of nationalism through the collection of all these countries together. A lot of this populist backlash also comes from just a lot of xenophobia due to them working together to increase the amount of refugees across the country, or across all of the countries, especially as the refugee crisis continues to happen in Syria and in various other parts of the world. A lot of the backlash also just comes from individuals not necessarily trusting a bureaucratic state, or one that is more bureaucratic than just their individual states themselves. It's a pretty complicated situation, but at the end of the day, I probably understand the controversies over the European Union, so that way, if you do find any arguments related to that, it helps you understand the changing dynamics across Europe and across the world. Okay, now we should go ahead and look to what the Belt and Road Initiative is. This is a major infrastructure plan created by the Chinese government. There are infrastructure projects spearheaded by China that they want to spread across Asia, across Africa, across Europe. Even some stuff talks about it going across the Arctic, which is really interesting. And if you debated the September topic previous year related to the law of the seas, you might find a lot of familiar arguments related to the Arctic on this topic. Something else to realize is obviously governments start infrastructure projects not to just lift people out of poverty, because there's not a huge incentive for governments to lift people out of poverty outside of their borders. Most of the reasons why China's participating in this activity is probably to give them more legitimacy and power. Whether that's a good thing or not, that's obviously up to most of these rounds to decide, but that's something to keep in mind, especially on the negative side, when a lot of these infrastructure projects do in fact probably lift people out of poverty through the building of bridges, roads, energy systems, water systems, etc., because it gives people access to newer markets, it gives people access to cheaper goods, simply because you have like more projects oriented to giving people more accessible things. These types of projects are not unprecedented in history. The United States participated in an infrastructure program largely to increase its own influence. This is referred to largely as the Marshall Plan and came after World War II. And the United States wanted to like help Europe a ton, also gain a lot of European allies, so they invested in a ton of infrastructure across Europe in order to increase their like diplomatic power and increase their like perceptual strength around the world after World War II. Something to note about the Marshall Plan versus this Chinese Belt and Road Initiative project is the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative project is largely oriented on the creation of loans. So the countries that partake in the Belt and Road project or get infrastructure built by China in their own country are going to have to pay China back. That matters a lot because it means that China is definitely gaining something. While in the Marshall Plan, European countries didn't necessarily have to like look to the United States to like do anything for it. China gets at least money, at the very least, when they invest in infrastructure across these countries. We'll talk a little bit more about that when we get into the different arguments. A couple of framework things that you should know before you actually dive into this topic is there are probably two common ways to interpret this resolution. The first one is probably the most obvious. The European Union joining on allows for Belt and Road Initiative projects to impact the European people. This is probably the easiest way to gain some sort of offense in the realm. Infrastructure projects lift people out of poverty in Europe. And this could be done through greater jobs, through the creation of infrastructure projects, through helping businesses grow, through the accessibility or through getting access to greater infrastructure and being able to access greater labor, being able to access cheaper goods, etc., etc. Or the other way you can gain offense in the round, and this one's probably more unique but more impactful, is this idea of you find some sort of reason why the European Union endorsing the Belt and Road Initiative changes the way the Belt and Road Initiative functions. This could be because maybe the Belt and Road Initiative is about to fail or about to fall apart, and the European Union would secure it either by giving it perceptual strength because they're looking to China for infrastructure instead of countries like the United States or more well-known, powerful nations around the world. Or you could simply say that they need funding and the Belt and Road Initiative now receives the funding it needs through them building more infrastructure projects across Europe. A lot of different ways to interpret, I think, this topic. The one reason why the second one ends up being more impactful is because you can impact a lot more to developing countries rather than just the European Union, right? If the Belt and Road Initiative can now continue to spread across East Asia, can spread across to African countries, can spread into the Arctic, can spread across who knows where, the Middle East, it allows for you to access people who are poorer than just the people in Europe. It allows for you to get, on the negative at least, to more interesting impacts, possibly warlike scenarios or stuff that relates to access to oil or gas. So most of the time, I think probably on this topic is people will read the second. And if someone does read the second and you're reading the first, it's probably better to not answer the second just because you won't be able to access a lot of offense if you want to read turns or disadvantages in the rebuttal towards that argument. So instead, if you are just reading the first, be like, yeah, it helps Europe and it hurts these countries. But you want to make sure you walk a fine line so you don't like double turn yourself and don't make a lot of sense through saying, oh, infrastructure is good in Europe, but it's like bad in the Middle East or like bad in African countries. Or if you do that, make sure you have like a warrant that explains the distinction so you don't end up like double turning yourself. Okay, now let's dive deeper into the different arguments on this topic. The first one we've been talking about for a while is just the idea, well, this is going to be on the affirmative, this idea of decreasing poverty. Roads, bridges, water systems, energy systems, any type of infrastructure can decrease poverty in so many different ways. Infrastructure is just generally good. It can give the poor access to newer markets. If you're in rural areas, you probably don't have access to the larger cities or being able to get to the larger cities, or if you do, it's probably pretty difficult to get there. More infrastructure is good because you can get there and get cheaper goods, whether that's just because the larger city has cheaper goods, or it's because it now allows for the rural communities to compete against the larger cities and maybe develop themselves. Infrastructure projects more directly, someone's got to make a bridge, make a road, that creates jobs, that can be a good thing. There are a lot of arguments that China contracts their own workers out in order to build these infrastructure projects. I think it's a pretty mixed bag. Not every single Belt and Road Initiative project uses Chinese workers, but also, even if they are using Chinese workers, that doesn't necessarily mean it's taking away from the community whatsoever, because those Chinese workers still have to go ahead and develop those areas through like staying in areas in those communities. They also have to like eat there, so they're still fostering job creation through like helping local businesses, but also like you can still benefit Chinese workers and lift Chinese workers out of poverty. You're still impacting to some stuff there. Sorry, a little bit of a derail. Also, just infrastructure projects allow for growth to happen simply through allowing for businesses to have better ability to access new labor forces in areas, access more goods, access cheaper goods, and that allows for more development to happen. This could just be in the European Union, or you could use the second framework we were talking about earlier and find a reason why the European Union joining will allow for Belt and Road Initiative projects to spread more in the developing world. That's probably how you'll get bigger impacts, more interesting impacts. So many different nuances to this argument. It's probably the most popular argument on the topic, probably the truest argument on the topic, simply because it's true. When you build infrastructure, you decrease poverty. There are some interesting reasons why infrastructure could be bad that you need to just like make sure you like weigh against the poverty argument. I've heard arguments related to infrastructure projects across the developing world allows for greater like drug trafficking to take place because it gives access to terrorist organizations to smuggle things. Also heard an argument that is particularly good at weighing against poverty arguments about human trafficking and how human trafficking can actually occur on these infrastructure projects a lot of the time in the developing world. I mean, obviously, you can also argue that poverty is like a prerequisite to human trafficking, but if it doesn't mitigate enough poverty, like human trafficking will likely just continue to happen on these infrastructure projects. I guess another argument that's popular on the pro is this idea of helping the environment. Belt and Road Initiative allows for better energy systems, whether it's the use of green energy, because China's investing a lot in green energy projects, whether it's just allowing for greater efficiency to happen through just like cleaner coal technology being spread through the developing countries, because they don't necessarily rely on much other than the burning of just wood and burning of various other substances. This can be impacted out to curbing pollution, also can be impacted out to mitigating climate change. It's probably better to do the first one just because the link is easier to win. You're also impacting directly into lives rather than going through a series of hurdles in order to get your climate change impact. There's obviously also room to read this environment argument on the negative as well. A lot of people argue that these infrastructure projects will essentially allow for greater coal plants to be built in the developing world, and that can either worsen pollution or go ahead and prompt climate change to get even worse or speed it up in the near future. Another popular pro-argument is this idea of leverage, that the European Union joining will give greater ability for the Chinese projects to either have better human rights, either have a more effective way at alleviating poverty, either ensure that China doesn't take advantage of developing countries in various ways. This leverage argument is very similar to the September topic a previous year related to the law of the seas. That's an argument you can read as well. In my opinion, this argument is probably better in rebuttal, simply because if you read it in case, it probably only impacts out to mitigation of the neg argument at best, because it's not like Europe gets to decide entirely what China does, but instead it just like lets China be like fractionally better at alleviating poverty, committing less human rights violations. All right, let's go ahead and talk about neg arguments. There's a lot more different arguments on the negative side, a lot more arguments on the negative side, but that doesn't make them particularly better. Something to realize, impacting out to poverty is just pretty easy to win a lot of the time on the affirmative side. However, if you do read the second framework we talked about earlier that links into the European Union joining, makes China allow for Belt and Road Initiative projects to happen more in the developing world, you can probably do a lot better a job of impacting out to various scenarios. One interesting argument I heard is about just competition. There are a lot of different countries competing with the Belt and Road Initiative project. For example, Europe has its own connectivity plan, the United States has its own plan, and you can even argue that Europe endorsing the Belt and Road Initiative would kill all these other plans, and having more than one plan there allows for competition to take place that operates as not only a leverage argument to make all of them better, but also operates as alleviating even more poverty, because you have all of these countries in these regions competing to decrease poverty around the world, which is pretty awesome. It also is really strategic because it allows you to concede a lot coming from the affirmative side that happens to be more true, like the reduction of poverty through infrastructure projects. You just argue that not affirming allows for even greater poverty to be reduced. Another popular negative argument is an argument about debt traps. It's essentially the argument is that the loans provided by the Belt and Road Initiative from China are extremely predatory and allow China to influence other countries through making them pay back this loan. And this can be making them default because they don't have enough money. This can be just through the threat of them owing money. China can dictate what policies they pass. This can also be through just influencing alliances in the future, because if countries owe money to China and cannot pay it back, China will likely try and get something from the country in some way. This argument can be impacted out into a lot of different things, which is why I like it so much. I probably steer away from the idea of countries just defaulting, because most of the time countries just don't default, with the exception of a few. Instead, it just allows for China to get more leverage in a lot of these countries through making really poor countries pay back money to China. Another argument, which I think is really interesting, is this tariffs argument that a lot of people, I think, are talking about running. It's this idea that if the EU signs on and joins the Belt and Road Initiative, the Trump administration is currently in negotiations with the European Union about putting tariffs on automobiles that come from Europe into the United States. And one of the ways Trump might react, or the way he generally reacts to countries that betray the United States or are working against the United States, however you want to interpret it, is he'll put tariffs on individual countries or on the European Union or on other countries. And most economists generally agree that tariffs are not very helpful, not only for the nations that are putting it on countries, but also for the nations themselves that get tariffs put on them. So you can impact out to a lot of things, but for the most part, you're impacting out to a United States backlash argument, leading to increases in the amount of poverty. Other arguments that can be read is there are a lot of Chinese militarism arguments that a lot of the time when these infrastructure projects are being built, China's also sending the People's Liberation Army or its military out to protect them. So you can argue that the increase in military presence from China allows for China to have a lot more influence around the world, or increases the risk of war simply because that there is more of a military out there to compete with the United States, or that China is simply acting provocatively against a lot of its enemies that happen to be United States allies a lot of the time, which I think is a particularly interesting argument. Really interesting way I think you can turn this argument is that a lot of the projects that they're investing in Africa, which a lot of the projects they're investing in Africa, they are also sending out their military to protect. And obviously there's a lot of terrorist problems in a lot of these African countries, and the People's Liberation Army is doing a really good job at protecting a lot of the time the African people from these militia organizations. So this is a really interesting stability argument you could read, that Chinese militarism is in fact good. More specifically, a lot of the literature talks about how the infrastructure projects in Somalia that China's investing in is doing a really good job of protecting Somalian people from pirates in the region. Another argument that can be read on negative is this idea that it allows for greater Chinese perceptual strength around the world, simply because China is obviously not a democracy and instead is an autocracy. Europe turning its back on the United States and endorsing an infrastructure project coming from China is a pretty big deal, and might lead to countries around the world turning to autocracy, looking to China in how they want to structure their governments. Also could just look to China in the way that China does things, and essentially hurt a lot of U.S. Strength, or the current international system that relies primarily on the United States Army or relies entirely on the United States diplomatic power, and instead looking to China, creating a very bipolar world. There's a lot of different arguments on this topic. It's super cool. I hope you all have a fantastic season. I hope that was helpful. I look forward to seeing how everyone does on this topic. Thanks so much for listening. Goodbye.